All right. Well, good to see you all. Zadie, Paul, Judd, Mayor, and Phyllis, welcome. I know we're starting at 7 o'clock on the dot, so hopefully a few more of our friends will be joining us momentarily. We find ourselves on Bays, Amid Bays, all the way on the top of 2b. And in order to understand this Gemara, we need to briefly rehash what we learned last time. Previously, in Maseches Sukkah, we learned in the Mishnah that there was a machlokis between the Rabbanan, the anonymous opinion, Tanakama, and Rabbi Yehuda regarding a sukkah that exceeds 20 amos. According to Rabbanan, if it exceeds 20 amos, it's pasul. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's still kosher. Later on, soon we'll talk about under what circumstances this debate takes place. But just before we jump into the Gemara, let's give a little bit of background. So in this debate about 20 amos, the Gemara asked the question, what's so significant about 20 amos? So we have three opinions in the Gemara, two of which we'll be spending more time on tonight. One reason was it says in the pasuk, "Laman yedu dorosechem." You should be aware that you're in a sukkah. When it's 20 amos high, you're not aware of the skach on top of you. That was the opinion of Rabbah. Rabbi Zera said the issue is that it has to be litzel. And if the sukkah is 20 amos tall, you're sitting in the shade of the walls, not in the shade of the skach. And then the third opinion that Gemara mentioned was that of Rava, which we're going to spend less time on this evening, is that the sukkah needs to be a diras arai. The sukkah needs to be a temporary dwelling. And if a sukkah exceeds 20 amos, according to the Chachamim, it is categorically an established dwelling, not a temporary dwelling. So anyway, that's just a quick review from last time. Anyone who's joining us now, we are about to jump into Bays, Amid Bays. And with that background of understanding the three opinions we mentioned last time, the Gemara is going to ask why each Amora did not simply adopt the other one's reasoning. So Kulu Karabulo Amri, Ahu Yedia Lidorosi. The reason that the other two Amoraim did not adopt Rabbah's reasoning for why 20 amos is the threshold is because they said the pasuk that says Laman Yedu is not talking about knowing that you're in a sukkah. It's talking about a more general idea for the Doros of knowing that God put us in sukkahs and God gave us the Anani Hakavod, the clouds of glory. So they dismiss it as having halachic significance. Whereas my Rebbe, my Rebbeinu Wa'i or Sobolovsky, what he would dismiss as he'd say, it's a nice Shabbos morning sermon topic.
But Rabbi, doesn't that need explanation? Laman Yedu. It's not clear from those words.
Yeah. So you look at Rashi. It says, it's not talking about knowing that you're sitting in a sukkah. Rather, it's just general recalling the memory that God settled us in sukkahs and God gave us the clouds of glory when we were in the wilderness. But it's a more general point rather than a halachic point about the parameters of the sukkah. Okay. Next. Rabbi Zera Namilo Amri. Now, why did the other two Amoraim not adopt Rabbi Zera's reasoning that when the sukkah exceeds 20 amos, you are no longer in the shade of the skach, you're in the shade of the walls. So when it's talking about sail, about shade in the pasuk, it's talking about the sukkahs in the times of Mashiach. Rashi says, Osam sukkahs yilatzel oneg lemistar, al sukkahs mitzvah ina letzel. It's talking about in the end of days, we're going to have these special sukkahs to protect us, but it's not referring to the mitzvah sukkah. There's no halachic significance to those words. However, Rabbi Zera would disagree. He would counter back and say, Rabbi Zera, imkain lema kra v'chuppah tiyeh letzel yomam, my v'sukkah tiyeh letzel yomam, shmat minei tarti. If it's just talking about general protection, Why did it just use the word chuppah instead of sukkah? So the fact that we have a sukkah telling us that we have shade for the sukkah, it's to teach us two things. One, so Shmat Minei Tardi. We learned two things. One, being Mos HaMashiach in the end of days, and the other, what Rabbi Zera said, it has halachic significance that's teaching us that you must be dwelling in the shade of the schach. It's not sufficient to dwell only in the shade of the walls. And that's why a sukkah that exceeds 20 amos would not be kosher according to the Chachamim. Finally, Kravanami lo Amri, why did the other two Amoraim not adopt Rava's rationale? That the reason a sukkah exceeds 20 amos is possible according to the Chachamim is because it's no longer a diras keva. Sorry, it's no longer a diras sarai. It's no longer a temporary dwelling. So Mishum Kushi de Abai, because if you remember last week, Abai challenged Rava, unsurprisingly. Abai challenges Rava and says that a sukkah could be, according to you, if it's all about dimensions, that's ridiculous because I can then build the walls of my sukkah out of iron and it would still be a kosher sukkah according to you. I mean, according to everyone, yet we know that's not a diras arai. We know that's not a temporary dwelling if it's made out of iron. So they, even though there was an answer to Abaye, the other Amoraim thought that Abaye's kasha on Rava was stronger than Rava's response, and therefore they do not adopt Rava's rationale. At any rate, we still have that machlokis. We still have that machlokis in the Mishnah regarding a sukkah that's over 20 amos. Now, here's the thing. The Gemara now is going to give us three suggestions as to what's the context of the debate in the Mishnah. Is it any case across the board that a sukkah is over 20 amos, it's automatically puzzle? Or maybe the Chachamim and Yehuda are only arguing within more limited circumstances than we would have been led to believe, like we did last week. For instance,
if I can interrupt, one of the footnotes that I read is that the reason on the grounds of it automatically being a permanent structure if it's over 20 amos is because in order to support the walls, it would have to be built with the strength of a permanent structure in order for the walls to stand.
I think that's pshat in the Gemara that we saw. I think that's pshat in the Gemara from the end of last time. Yeah. It would require some fastening that would make it keva. Yeah. All right.
That brought up the subject of iron because of the strength of iron.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Yes. Okay. So now, Kaman Azla Hadam Rav Yoshi Amarav Machlokis b'she'ein dafanos magios eschach al dafanos magios eschach afilu mala me'esrim ama kishera. So Rav Yoshia quotes the name of Rav that the entire machlokis in our Mishnah regarding a sukkah that's above 20 amos, whether it's kosher, is only in a case in which the walls do not reach the schach. Remember last time we learned that the walls are even just 10 tefachim tall. We'll talk about this in the Gemara later. There's a concept of good asik mechitzta that we view halachically as if the walls extend all the way up to the top. So in that case, that's where the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda are arguing about a sukkah that exceeds 20 amos. However, if the walls reach the schach, it would still be kosher, even according to the Chachamim. How so? Come on, Karabba, because this is in accordance with Rabbah. The Amar Mishum de Lo Sholta Be'ena. Because what was Rabbah's concern? Rabbah said the concern of the Chachamim was that you wouldn't be aware of the schach hovering over your head if it's so tall. But who came into the funus makias schach, the shai sholta be'ena. But since the walls reach the schach, you're going to look up and you say, oh wait, where's that wall going? It's going. There's the schach over there. But if the walls did not go all the way up to the schach, you would be left with the impression, perhaps, unless you're craning all the way up, that there's no schach above you, or you wouldn't have an awareness of it. Okay, so that's the first opinion. However, there's an alternative report by Rav Huna in the name of Rav. So everyone seems to have different ideas of what Rav said. Machlokis b'she'ein ba ela arba amos al arba amos. What is the machlokis in the Mishnah? The machlokis in the Mishnah between Rav Huna and Chachamim regarding a 20 plus amos sukkah is only in the context of a sukkah that's 4 by 4 amos. Aval yeshba yosmer arba amos amos. But if the sukkah has wider, longer dimensions than 4 by 4 amos, even the Chachamim would concede that it's kosher, even though it exceeds 20 amos. Why is that? Come on, Rabbi Zera, because he holds like Rabbi Zera. Darmishim Selvu, who came into Ravicha Ika Sel Sukkah. So it's because we have this opinion of Rabbi Zera who says, what's the concern of Chachamim? The concern of Chachamim is that the sukkah is too tall. You will be sitting in the shade of the walls, not of the schach. But if we widen out the dimensions of the sukkah, so then it'll turn out that even though the schach's really high up, if the sukkah is sufficiently wide enough, it's sufficiently stretched out enough, the shade from the schach will be significant, and you'll be once again sitting within the shade of the schach. So even the Chachamim would be okay with that. Finally, a third and final interpretation of what precisely the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda are arguing in is similar to the last one that we just read now. It's about the dimensions of the sukkah, just he gives a smaller dimensions. Come on. Also, Amarav Chana bar Rabba Amarav Machlokis b'she'ena machzekes elgedei rosh rubo shulchano. Their machlokis in the Mishnah regarding a 20 plus amos sukkah is only regarding a really small sukkah. You ever see those you'll see the Chabad Bacharim with the little sukkahs on their bikes, or you see pop-up sukkahs. So it's because we paskin this way, that of the minimum dimensions for a sukkah is enough to hold a person, his head, most of his body, and a very small thin table in order for you to dwell in there. That's 7 by 7 tefachim. A tefach is roughly 4 inches, maybe a little bit less, depending who you paskin like. So 4 times 7 is 28. 28. Yeah. So it's 28 inches, just a little more than 2 feet. So you're not working with a lot. So because the dimensions are really small, that's when the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda are arguing. But once the sukkah is bigger than 7 by 7 tefachim, even if it's above 20 amos, the Rabbanan would concede it's okay. And Kamad, however, this opinion does not seem to align with either of the 3 Amoraim that we saw last week. If we go through each and every one of them, why not? If it's about awareness of sitting in the sukkah, unclear how once it's larger than 7 by 7 tefachim, how there be sholta be'ena. If it's about sale, expanding the sukkah a little bit bigger than 7 by 7 tefachim, when we're talking about a 20 amos sukkah, you're still going to be sitting in the shade of the walls. And if it's a matter of a diras keva or a diras sarai, about a temporary dwelling, again, expanding the sukkah beyond 7 by 7 tefachim doesn't really change whether it's considered a temporary or permanent dwelling place. So we don't really have anyone to align him with. But ironically, we'll see next week, that's actually how we passed him. Okay. So the Gemara is going to ask, Bishlama, Rav Yoshia, Pligad Rav Huna, Rav Chana bar Rabba, Inhu ka yavi sheyura b'mishcha, v'ihu lo ka yav sheyura b'mishcha. So, okay, I understand how Rav Yoshia disagrees with Rav Huna and Rav Chana bar Rabba, because Rav Yoshia says, this was the first opinion we saw tonight, and there's a lot of different, there's a machlokis, right? There's a machlokis about what the machlokis is in the Mishnah. That it's a little bit confusing, right? Because you have the Rabbanan and you have Rabbi Yehuda arguing about a 20 amos sukkah, but then we have a machlokis on top of that about what case are Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim disagreeing about a 20 amos sukkah. Are they disagreeing about 20 amos sukkah when the walls don't reach the top? Are they disagreeing about 20 amos sukkah when it's not sufficiently wide enough? Right? So that it's admittedly a little bit confusing. There's like layers to this. The machlokis about what the machlokis is about, right? Okay, so I understand the first opinion, right? I understand the first opinion of Rav Yoshia's report. Rav Yoshia, the reason he disagrees with the other two Amoraim we just cited, is because for him, it's not about the dimensions, it's about whether the walls reach the schach or not. So you have sholta be'ena. So that way you're aware of the schach hanging over you. However, what seems to be a little bit unclear to us at this juncture is Ela Rav Huna, Rav Chana bar Rabba, what are they disagreeing about? Because remember, we had Rav Huna. Rav Huna said, as long as it's 4 amos, they're arguing 4 by 4. Once you expand beyond 4 by 4 amos, then Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim are in agreement that 20 amos plus is fine. And then we have the opinion of Rav Chana bar Rabba, who says that as long as it's expanded beyond 7 by 7 tvachim, then the sukkah is fine according to everyone. So what are they fundamentally disagreeing about? Because both of them seem to be saying the same thing in principle. As long as you widen the shear of the sukkah, both the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda are okay with 20 plus amos. So what's the basis of their disagreement? Are they giving two arbitrary different measurements? What's happening over here? So the first suggestion to Gemara is, El Rav Huna bar Chana bar Rabba, name up a hechsher sukkah k'miflagi. Maybe their machlokis is about what is the minimum shear of a sukkah, the minimum dimensions for a sukkah. The Mar Savar hechsher sukkah ba'arba amos, Umar Savar hechsher sukkah ba'asegis rosh Hashanah. Maybe they're in disagreement about what the minimum shear, the minimum dimensions are of a sukkah. According to one opinion, it's 7 by 7 tvachim. So, and according to the other opinion, it's 4 by 4 tvachim. And once you expand, both of them agree, once you expand beyond the minimum dimensions, then you can even have a 20 plus amos sukkah according to everyone. That's one way to understand the machlokes. They fundamentally disagree on what the minimum dimensions for a sukkah are. However, the Gemara says maybe they're not in such sharp disagreement with each other. Rather, Umar Savar, sorry, I skipped something. Where I lost it. Look, the Kule Alma Hechsher Sukkah Rosh Rubo Shulchan. Rather, everyone agrees that 7 by 7 tvachim, right? 2 feet and 4 inches, depending on again how you measure it. We're measuring generously here. Everyone agrees that is the minimum dimensions of a sukkah for everybody. But what are they arguing about? They're not arguing about what the minimum dimensions for a sukkah are. Their disagreement is about what are the Chachamim right who are disagreeing about in the context of 20 plus amos. What is the range that that 20 amos is questionable? Demar Savar b'Machzekes Rosh Hashanah pligi Abba Yosef Rosh Hashanah Divrei Kol Kshera. So according to Rav Chana bar Rabba, as long as you expand beyond the minimum dimensions of a sukkah, even the Chachamim are okay with you exceeding 20 amos. Umar Savar Rosh Hashanah Adan Amos pligi Abba Yosef Adan Amos Divrei Kol Kshera. Whereas according to the opinion of Rav Huna says that even if you expand beyond the minimum shear of a sukkah, as long as it remains smaller than Dal by Dalid amos, 4 by 4 amos, Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim will have their machlokas. But even according to Chachamim, once you exceed 4 by 4 amos, so then the sukkah can be as tall as you want. Beautiful.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can one extrapolate from this that, let's say you have a sukkah that's beyond the minimum, whether it's 4 or 7, let's say it's 10 by 10. If you have enough schach to just cover the required minimum, is that still a kosher sukkah?
Well, the challenge we get to, which we'll talk about soon, and then the coming shiurim, is that when there's air gaps in the sukkah, it can be problematic. There's puzzle schach is a problem, but also having air gaps is a problem. So if you're just going to somehow suspend 7 by 7 tefachim in mid-air, in middle of a sukkah, and have air surrounding it between the walls, you probably don't have a kosher sukkah over there. But we're going to talk about methods where some air is okay. What about lavud, when it's within 3 tefachim of each other? We're going to talk about dofen akuma, in which the wall is viewed as extending into the ceiling. So we'll come up with different kinds of special rabbinic measures and methods used to close the gap. So the Gemara will address these different kinds of permutations. Not to worry, we will get into the thick of the matter. It's coming up, trust me. Okay. Now this is going to be a lot of fun. This sugya that we're going to talk about coming up is connected. We're still within the general sugya of a 20 amma sukkah, but we're going to, as Gemara discussions work, in passing, we're going to refer to a very important sugya called the sugya of chinuch, of Jewish education, of educating one's children. As we know, or if we don't know now, you know, a child, a boy under 13, a girl under 12, before they are b'nei mitzvah, they are not b'nei mitzvah. So they're not chayiv in mitzvahs. However, rabbinically, we'll see there is an imperative for children to be performing mitzvahs once they reach what's called the gil chinuch, the age of chinuch. It differs. There's different opinions in Rishonim. It can be like 7, 8, 9, depending on the child. So this is going to be very relevant because we're going to have a question right now on the position that holds that the machlokes Reihud and the Chachamim is only in the case of where there's smaller dimensions, but the bigger dimensions, then it's okay. We're going to ask a question from a brisa on that assumption. And by doing so, we're going to be talking about children and the mitzvah of sukkah. So you'll see exactly what I mean right now. Here we go. Meisvei. So we're citing a brisa now that would seem to indicate that the machlokes Reihud and Chachamim has nothing to do with the minimum dimensions of a sukkah or the minimum dimensions of dal by dal and amos. How so? Here we go. We have to go through a bit of the brisa to get to the question. So the question actually only ends, I think, on the top of Gimel Amid Aleph, top of 3a. So we're gonna bring in a whole brisa right now, some information and inferences to get to the question. Okay, so the question only comes at the end. Here we go. Enjoy the story in the meantime. Meisvei. Sukkah she'gavo l'mala me'esrim amma psua. So, no surprise, the brisa reiterates the machlokes that's found in our Mishnah. The Chachamim hold that a sukkah that's about 20 amos is pasul, it's invalid. Rabbi Yehuda makshir on our 45 amma. And Rabbi Yehuda is like, you go 40 amos tall, you go 50 amos tall, have fun with your sukkah. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda, unlike in our Mishnah is very terse. This brisa, Rabbi Yehuda actually supports his position with the following anecdote. Maisa behelni hamalka. Apparently there was a Jewish queen named Helena. There's a story with Helni Hamalka, below Shahaisa Sukasa Gavoma Esther Amma, that she had a sukkah that, lo and behold, exceeded 20 amos. And all the elders from the community were going in, going out. She was having a space Hashaleva party, whatever it was. They're having a sukkah hop. And all these rabbis were busy going in and going out and visiting the royal family, and they didn't say anything. Now, here you have a sukkah that's egregiously tall, it exceeds 20 amos, and the rabbis did not say anything to Hilni, which would seem to imply the fact that they did not mention that there was a problem with the sukkah, shtika kodah, would imply that they were okay with the sukkah that exceeds 20 amos. That's Rabbi Yehuda's proof. So you see, he says, the earlier rabbis were on my side. There's no minimum height to the sukkah. However, the Chachamim respond, Amarlo, Misham Raya, is that really going to be the basis of your proof against us? Isha Haisam Termin a sukkah. Hilni was a woman. Women are exempt from sitting in a sukkah because of the time-bound mitzvah. So the reason the rabbis didn't want to make a whole kerfuffle out of it was because she's putter from the mitzvah of sukkah anyway. So she could sit inside the house for all they care. Amar lahed, Rabbi Yehuda though defends the basis of his proof. She had 7 sons. And we know she was very conscientious that she followed the words of the sages. Now, what's that mean? What does Rabbi Yehuda mean to convey in his point when he says that she followed the words of the sages? This is what he was telling them. Rabbi Yehuda was saying, now, if you'll say, well, who cares that she had 7 sons? The same way she's exempt from sitting in a sukkah at all. Children are also exempt from sitting in a sukkah because they're not b'nei mitzvah yet. So don't think that, because let's do some math. Keva the Shiva Havu, since she had 7 children, even if she had 7 sons, even if she had 7 sons, one after the other, certainly at least one of them would be older enough that he wouldn't be, fully dependent on his mother. In other words, he would be at the age of chinuch. Now you might say, well, what's the proof? Even though the child, whatever he is, 7, 8 years old, is now in need of chinuch, that's only on dirabanan. Maybe she was a cat, maybe she was a Karaite. I don't know. Maybe she didn't like rabbinic Judaism. So Tashemav, that's why Rabbi Yehuda had to then follow up and say, and by the way, you should know she was very conscientious and she made sure to follow the ways of the rabbis. So in other words, what is Rabbi Yehuda's proof? Right, his proof is, we see from the fact that Hildy was with her sons in a sukkah that was above 20 amos, and the rabbis did not chastise her. They didn't tell her to lower it. They didn't tell her to move her sons that were in need of chinuch to a shorter sukkah, means that the rabbis were okay with a 20 amma plus sukkah. And that's Rabbi Yehuda's counterpoint to the Chachamim. Now, why do we bring in this entire story? Well, number one, it's already nice just to see that there's more discussion between Chacham and Rabbi Yehuda. If all you did was read our Mishnah, the discussion ended at the disagreement. There wasn't this whole shock of Vitari, this whole back and forth. But the real reason we're bringing it in is because this is a question, because from this Raisa, it would seem that the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda could only be arguing under certain circumstances. Because So remember, we had 3 opinions as to what is the context, what is the context of the machlokis Rabbi Yehuda and the Chacham for 20 Amma Sukkah. And the first opinion we saw was that it's about, they're only arguing the walls do not reach the schach. That makes sense. That could very well be the case. After all, it's very reasonable for a queen to want a sukkah. She has all these people who are coming to visit her. She probably would like the place to be aired out a little bit. So it's very plausible that Hilya Malka was sitting in a sukkah that the walls did not fully reach the schach, so there was air ventilation. That's okay. The Brisa does not contradict that interpretation. What it does seem to contradict, though, is however, if we want to suggest that the whole machlokis Yehuda and Chachamim is only limited to a context of a smaller sukkah, according to either Rav Huna or Rav Chana bar Rabba, whether it's 4 amos or 7 tefachim, do you think Hildy was in a small sukkah? No, she had a grand sukkah to fit her, her children, her advisors, her whole retinue. So how can we say that the machlokis of the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yehuda is only limited to the context of a small sukkah, when Rabbi Yehuda's whole basis for his argument against the Rabbanan is in the context of a sukkah fit for a queen and all of her entourage? That doesn't seem to make any sense. You got the question? I want to make sure that's clear before we go forward. I can repeat, I can rephrase. Do you want anyone want me to rephrase or rehash? Good. Okay. So the question is, how can you say the machlokes is in a small sukkah if the whole quintessential case that they're arguing in is about a sukkah fit for a queen? So one possibility is Amar Rabba Barav Ada lo nitzracha el sukkah kitonios kitonios. Maybe, look at this creativity over here. This is a sukkah with multiple little rooms, little cubicles. Like you could go into an office space and they'll have cubicles. So just imagine like these cubicles had really tall walls, and they were all within the same general structure, but each little room, each little cubicle was 7 by 7 tefachim, or was 4 by 4 amos. Maybe that. So you know what? We could still maintain the Yehuda and the Chum were arguing in a case of a small sukkah because there were sub sukkahs within the general structure. However, we run into the same problem as before. Is a queen going to subject herself to, she's going to sit in one little cubicle, then her guard is going to sit in the next little cubicle. Like the whole thing doesn't make any sense. Amar Avashi, lo nitzracha el kitonio shabbat. Rather, there was one grand sukkah, and she had her own little room within the sukkah. Now, how big was that room is the question. Rabbanan Sabri Baneba Sukkah Haviyasve. The Rabbanan say the fact that Hilni sat in a small sukkah that's 20 amos tall, a small cubicle, is not a good proof because presumably her sons who were Chayv and Chinuch were sitting in the larger part of the sukkah that could exceed 20 amos because it's a big sukkah. And she just sat in a small cubicle because of tznius. And that's why the Chacham didn't say anything to her, because her sons that were Chayv and Chinuch were sitting in the larger sukkah, and the Rabbanan are fine with the larger sukkah that exceeds 20 amos. However, Rabbi Yehuda's whole argument is that her sons were sitting alongside her in that small cubicle. And even still, the rabbis didn't say anything, which that's why Rabbi Yehuda sees it as a proof positive for him that a sukkah, even if it's small in width and length, if it exceeds 20 amos, it's still okay, according to Rabbi Yehuda. So what we establish is, at the end of the day, we can still maintain that the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan is still in the context of smaller dimensions of the sukkah. But if we expand the dimensions of the sukkah, the width and length, then even the Rabbanan will be okay with 20 amos tall. That's the end of the Gemara section I want to share with you this evening. Let me just pause. Is there anything I can clarify at this point before we jump into Tosos and we jump into some Rishonim and Achronim? Anything I can clarify? Again, I fully sympathize that there's a few layers to the Gemara over here. There's a few layers of Machlokes. This last part especially was a little bit long-winded to get to the question and answer. So again, I'm happy to rehash anything before we go forward. All right, I waited till K'nei Dibur, so that's good. Okay, so if I can have your attention for a moment, take a look at the first Tosos on the page here. Tosos refers to actually what Rashi says beforehand. Here's a bit of an issue. Even according to Rabbi Yehuda's assumption is what? That her sons, and Hilni's sons, are sitting next to her. Now, remember, generously, how big is 7 by 7 tefachim? Well, forget about the measurement. 7 by 7 tefachim, by definition, is enough space for one person to fit Rosha Rubo Shulchano, his head, most of his body, and some really portable small little table. So I have a question. If the whole machlokes is about 7 by 7 tefachim, how, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is Hilni fitting in there with all of her 7 sons? What kind of joke is that? According to Rashi says, that according to Rav Chana bar Rabba, we don't have a good answer to this section over here, because how can we say the whole machlokes is by 7 by 7 tefachim when you can't fit 7 sons into a 7x7 tefach sukkah. So Tosos answers, the Dilma, this is the end of Tosos. La Pirchehi, the Dilma, Rucha Tuva. Maybe, what's the Machlokes Yehuda and the Chachamim? Maybe her cubicle was not a cubicle. It was actually really, really long. But the width was very prohibitive. The width was not even 7 tefachim. So you can imagine it's just like a really long sukkah or long cubicle. It's not a cubicle anymore. I don't know what you call it. A long sub room within the sukkah, and then all of a sudden just sat along there. So that's the suggestion of Tosos. But what's really interesting about this Tosos is that there is a debate in the Nosei Kiyam and Shulchan Aruch about the girsa, the text of Tosos. You might even see it. Depending on the version you have, you might see I have a little vav over here pointing to the Agos Tziyunim, which tells us that according to some versions of Tosos, there's a word that's missing here. There should be a word that says Lo Ella Shiva Tfachim. It was a very long sukkah, and the width was at least 7 tfachim. So in other words, it was a 7x7 tefach sukkah, and then the length is extended. So what comes out from the two ways to read Tosos is the following question. And this, by the way, is reflected in Hilchos Mezuzah as well. The Rush and others, they align the same place. So the minimum shear for putting up a mezuzah on somewhere is that it has to be 4 by 4 amos. So the question that comes up is, what about a walk-in closet? So a walk-in closet might be 4 by 4 amos square footage, but what if something, let's say, is 2 by 8 amos? So on the one hand, you have the same amount of square footage. On the other hand, though, maybe 4 by 4 is a hard line minimum. Depending how you read this Tosos over here, it could read either way. If you read Tosos the way that appears, at least in my Vilna Gemara over here, the Rabbi Yehuda was willing to be Makshir Sukkah, even if the width was less than 7 tefachim. But as long as it was really long, square footage-wise, you would have square feet that would add up to at least what 7 by 7 tefachim would have been. However, according to those who add in the word Ella, this is why, yourselves is sometimes very technical, but one word could change everything. And it says, the assumption, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, is that the machlokes is still has to be at least 7 tefachim in width. And then we could argue if the length is bigger than 7 tefachim, maybe we still have a machlokes. But you can't just rely on square footage alone. So that's why, by the way, halach l'maisa, when putting up mezuzahs in one's home, the way you're supposed to do it is you put up a mezuzah like on your entryway, or put your mezuzah up, for your kitchen or somewhere that for sure requires a mezuzah. And then the bracha you make on the mezuzah that you put up at a place that certainly requires one, you have in mind will count as well for when you put up the mezuzah, let's say on a walk-in closet that doesn't necessarily require one, but mishum safek, because according to some, it's about square footage, therefore you hang it up. Which, by the way, that's another great example of where a chumrah, stringency in one area is a leniency in the other area, and vice versa. Because it's a kula, when it comes to sukkah, generally we want our sukkahs to be as flexible in terms of how, kashrus. I want my sukkah to be kosher. So if I could rely on square footage alone, that affords me more flexibility. But if it's when it comes to Hilchos Mezuzah, mezuzahs cost a lot of money. Generally, if someone doesn't have to put up a mezuzah somewhere, they prefer not to do it unless they already own enough mezuzahs. So the holding that square footage alone can be mechayev even without the minimum official dimensions of 4 by 4. That's actually going to create a chumrah. That creates more of an inconvenience for someone, because then they're buying mezuzah for their walk-in closet when they don't necessarily require it.
Rabbi, doesn't it matter also not only what size it is, but what it's used for?
What it?
What it's used
Well,
for,
yeah,
it's
I mean,
used.
certain things, for instance, Beis HaKnesset doesn't require one. Certainly, Beis HaKisei doesn't require one. So it could, use does play a factor in it to a certain degree. Okay. Another point I wanted to share with you is the Aruch HaNer. The Aruch HaNer addresses the important question. Here's the question. The question, if you look at the Gillian, there's I don't want to say famous, but in the Sukkah, it's a famous Gillian Hashas, where Rabbi Akiva Eger asked the following question. Wait a minute, I don't understand. When we say, remember that Brisa Rabbi Yehuda was trying to say, the Chachamim we see that since the boys who reached the age of Chinuch are Chaim and Chinuch min Rabbanan, that's why Hilni, who was concerned for the words of the sages, ensured to give them proper Chinuch and would put them in a kosher sukkah. So here's the question that comes out. The question is, he writes, the obligation of Chinuch for sure applies to the father. It doesn't necessarily apply to the mother. Rabbi Akiva Eger and a significant school of poskim believe that women, the mother, does not have a mitzvah of chinuch vis-a-vis their child. Now, it doesn't mean that the mother should, God forbid, throw their kid out on the street. But what it means is that she doesn't have a formal legal halakhic obligation to mechanech her children. If that's true, who cares if the children are chayim and rabbanan? That doesn't say anything about Hilni. Hilni has no obligation to ensure that they're in a kosher sukkah. To which he quotes Tosi Yeshanim. Tosi Yeshanim gives, I believe, at least two answers. One answer is that apparently I don't know her husband's name, but there was a father. So Hilni wanted to ensure that even though the father was out, I don't know if he was learning in Kollel or he was out at war, whatever he was doing as a king, she was ensuring that her husband was able to fulfill his obligation in chinuch by her making sure that the children were in a kosher sukkah. And another approach is just like Tosi Yeshanim says, it's a mitzvah ba'alma. It's a night, she wanted to make sure that they're getting proper chinuch, even though she wasn't chayiv to make sure it happens. But with the Aruch HaNer gives a really he really gives two answers, one that builds upon the other, about why Hilni and Malka, even we accept Rabbi Akiva Eger's point that a woman is not chayiv to mechanech her children, nonetheless, the Aruch HaNer writes, Yesh lomar da'af isha ena mitzuva al chinuch mikol makom la'afrushe me'isura mitzuva. Even though she doesn't have to proactively train them to keep the mitzvahs, the positive mitzvahs from the Torah, she would still be required to prevent them from violating isurim in the Torah. And now here's the kicker. V'hacha efrushe me'isura mikre kaven da'aser lechol chutz misukah. And now what's the isser over here? The isser is that it's usher to eat outside the sukkah on sukkahs if you're having a meal. So even though she wasn't obligated to be mechanech her children, she, for instance, wouldn't be obligated to teach them how to shake lulav and esrog, the dalaminim. It'd still be incumbent upon her to ensure that they don't eat outside the sukkah and violate the isser of eating outside the sukkah. La frushe me'isura. What's the challenging assumption that the Aruch HaNer makes? The challenging assumption that the Aruch HaNer makes, bringing back our friend Postik Hador, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Zecher Tzad Kosh Racha. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach asked on this is apparently echoed as well in the Magen Avraham. He says, Avot Tzarech Yim, Minai Lurkain, Hare Ein Isser Ba'achil Chutz L'Sukkah, Rak Menia Mi Mitzvahs Aseh Shemischai Bakisha Ochol Yashin. The issue is, there's no Isser to eat outside the sukkah. It's that there's a mitzvah aseh, there's a positive mitzvah to eat in the sukkah. So what is Aruch HaNer saying? That if the kids eat outside the sukkah, the mother would still be obligated to get them into the sukkah because the Lafrushim Yisur kill from violating an Isser, a negative commandment. No, at worst, if they eat outside the sukkah, they're just failing to fulfill the positive commandment of eating inside the sukkah. which, if she doesn't have a mitzvah chinuch, she has no mitzvah to ensure that they eat in the sukkah. So that's Rosh Zalman Auerbach's question on the Aruch HaNer. But I see there's a question. I'll just finish up the Aruch HaNer. And if you think this is questionable enough, the Aruch HaNer takes it a step further. Which, oddly enough, I didn't see Rosh Zalman Auerbach reckon with this. I think Rosh Zalman Auerbach already didn't buy the premise of the Aruch HaNer, but the Aruch HaNer goes a step further than this. But wait, there's more. The Aruch HaNer says, "Va'od yesh lomar, da'af de'ein beistin mitzvah la'afrisho." Even if the beistin and the mother and achayiv to prevent him from performing isur in the Torah, mikol makom la'asufe le'biyadayim aser gevur b'orach chaim. Even if, there's no obligation for the mother to, she sees that her child bought an ice cream, they're on a trip and the child bought an ice cream extra and he starts eating it. She's not chayiv to smack it out of the kid's hand. However, certainly a mother can't feed her children treif food. And since she is feeding them inside an invalid sukkah, is as if she's feeding treif into their mouth. Certainly that's usher, regardless of whether she has an obligation to chinuch or not. So wow, the Aruch HaNer takes it even a step further. He's saying that if she brings them into that non-kosher sukkah, so then it's as if she's feeding treif right into their mouth. So certainly it'd be usher for her to do that. And that's, by the way, why you can't feed non-kosher food to your child, even if they're a baby. A baby's not obligated in the mitzvah of chinuch yet. Yeah, well, you're not allowed to still feed treif food to your child. You're not allowed to do that. So that's why it applies to children even under the age of chinuch. You're not allowed to directly feed them the non-kosher food. So that's where the Aruch HaNer goes. But again, we have Rosh Zalman Auerbach's question. It's just like maybe a lack of a positive mitzvah. It's not a violation of the Torah. But anyway, that would make sense now. And since Hilni Hamalka was scrupulous and ensured that her children ate inside a kosher sukkah, therefore that's Rabbi Yehuda's proof that even a 20 amma sukkah would be kishera. And I'll share with you. I'll just share with one final question, and I'll take all the questions at the end together. A very interesting point made. I saw in the Chidushi Rabbi Shmuel. I was just browsing through my my Kovetz Mefarshim over here. So in the end, they print the Chidushi Rabbi Shmuel, which is Rabbi Shmuel Rozovsky, very big name in the Olam HaYeshivos. So Rabbi Shmuel Rozovsky asks the following point. He says, "Shtemati lahakshos l'shitas Rabbeinu Tam the nashim avarchos al mitzvahs aseisha." You know what? Tafasta Marulo Tafasta. We'll learn about that soon. It's 7:48 right now. You know what? I'll open up with this one next time. I don't want to shove too many things in your face. I need you wanting for more next time. So we'll let me pause for any questions that we have. Zaidi, you had a question?
Yeah. Number one, if a child is pre-bar or bas mitzvah and eating in a sukkah is a positive mitzvah, they're not obligated in positive mitzvah. And also, if there is no father, he's dead or he's off in a war somewhere, doesn't the obligation to teach the children fall on the mother?
Either it would fall on the mother or it falls onto the beis din, which is code word for the community, and the mother would be the most obvious choice of the community members to assume that halachic responsibility. But what I didn't share with you is that there's a very radical shita of Tosos, I believe in Brachos, which believes that, when we talk about children being chayiv mitzvah d'Rabbanan, who's the obligation incumbent upon? Now, we've been talking about, is it incumbent upon the mother or not? It's certainly incumbent upon the father. There's a sheet that tells us that when we say children are chayiv midrabanan mitzvos, it means that the child himself or herself is obligated midrabanan in mitzvos. Very quickly, this is derived in Tosos. Tosos talking about trade to Rabbanans, how a child would be able to say Berachas Hamazon in theory for an adult. But a child's only chayiv midrabanan. The adult is chayiv midoraisa Berachas Hamazon, and they go through this whole thing about how the adult only had enough, didn't have a kedei spia, only ate on the Rabbanan level, and a child ate a kedei spia, so you can be motzim. But basically, in that whole sugi over there, Tos is assuming that a child is chayiv in mitzvos on a Rabbanan level, which leads Rabbi Chanan Wasserman to ask the following question. Wait a minute, how can it's a great question. He gives an answer about the Ratzon and Chacham, but the Kasha, I feel like, is better than the Teretz sometimes. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman asks, and I could just every so from I believe it makes sense. How can a child be chayiv mitzvahs midrabanan? Because if a child's not chayiv mitzvahs at all, well, what tells me that? What gives the rabbanan power? There's a mitzvah in the Torah, lo sasor, that tells us that you shouldn't stray from the words of the rabbis. But if a child is not chayiv in any mitzvahs in the Torah, isn't chayiv in the mitzvah of lo sasor, then he's not chayiv to listen to the rabbis. So what power do the rabbis have to even chayiv a child in a mitzvahs on a Rabbanan level if a child's not chayiv to follow the mitzvah of lo sasor to begin with? That grants the rabbis powers to mandate mitzvahs. So I remember he has like this thing about the Ratzon Chachamim. There's an important thing about following the will of the rabbis. I don't recall well enough to articulate it, but I remember having that question. When I saw Rabbi Chanan ask the same question, I felt very relieved to know that we were in good company. All right, shkayach everyone. Wishing you all a good Shabbos. Also, just wanted to remind you. I think I found out that I saw in the email that Lloyd Contract, who's a regular of our shir, his sister passed away recently, so I think he's sitting shiva just this evening. So hopefully, God willing, he should have much nechama, and we should share smachos together, Rabbosai.
Rabbi, next week after the time change, what are you going to do with the time of the year?
Okay, yeah. Keep a look at your emails. I might change it to 7:30, but we need to figure out a long-term strategy. I'll try to create a vote if people prefer to push it closer to 8 or closer to 6 o'clock.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so you will have to make a decision on that one. So we'll try and take a vote and see what works for most people. I dread this time of year when it happens.
Okay.
All right,
Good.
everyone. Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos.